Good morning, everybody. I'm Chris Ebi, Professor, Center for Health and Global Environment, University of Washington, and I co-chair ICONICS. It's my distinct pleasure this morning to host this webinar talking about the IPCC Expert Workshop on Scenarios. We're going to start with a presentation on the main outcomes of that workshop, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. Please put your questions in the Q&A function so that we can collate those questions and answer the ones that are asked most frequently. And we intend to go for an hour. So with that, it's early in the morning for me. Anna, we're starting with you, or we're starting with Alaa?
I think Alaa can go ahead.
Alaa?
I will start, yeah. Thank you.
Please introduce yourself, because I'm not going to try and butcher your name at this hour of the morning.
No,
And we look forward to the presentation.
Thank you. I'll share my slide and do the introduction from me and Anna. Can you see my slide?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon and good evening. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Alaa Khourdajie. I'm a senior scientist in the IPCC Working Group 3 Technical Support Unit. And today I'm joined with Anna Pirani, who is the head of the Technical Support Unit of IPCC Working Group 1. And today we will be providing you with an overview on the IPCC workshop that was held in April in Bangkok on the use of scenarios in AR6 and subsequent assessment. And we will focus on elements that are of most relevance to the ICONICS community. So thank you very much for joining us today. Just a little bit of background. The workshop was proposed by the co-chairs of the 3 working groups, and originally it was proposed as an expert meeting. However, members of the panel, that is governments, upgraded it to a workshop, which essentially signals the importance of the topic for governments, as well as it had an implication in terms of the selection of participants for the workshop. So the quota of number of participants in the workshop has increased, and it was only by nomination. So governments and members of the panel were nominating participants, and then members of the scientific steering committee of the workshop and the IPCC Bureau were selecting from this pool of nomination. And the mix that we ended up with included experts, but also government representatives and colleagues from the private sector, as well as other international assessments. The report of the workshop took about 3 months to prepare, and it was out this Monday. I'll provide the link towards the end. And in terms of running the presentation, so Anna and I will be sharing the presentation among each other, and at the end we will have a Q&A session which we will respond to, but also we will have inputs from members of the scientific steering committee who joined us today as well. Starting with summary of the scientific and the process goals of the workshop. What we aimed really in this workshop, or the proposal by the co-chairs, was to take stock of the use of scenarios in AR6. And here we're talking about all 3 working groups, not only working group 3 or 1, and then the strengths and the weaknesses of the practices during AR6. Identifying any gaps in the approach, not only within working groups, but also across working groups, and take into account consideration of or expectations of the users, that is policymakers, but as well as colleagues who use the scenarios data. How best to build on the RCP SSP framework in the future. So it is well known that there are 3 or 4 levels of ambition of updating the SSP's framework. baseline data, future projections, but also considering the narratives or the framework itself. And as you probably will know, the SSP's quantifications has been updated and was now it is open for consultation since last week. So that was a topic that was discussed, how to pursue innovations in the scenario approach with other research communities, such as biodiversity. We had colleagues from the biodiversity IPBES assessment, but also from UNEP Geo assessment attending the workshop. So how to further develop cross-working group collaboration, improvement in institutional mechanisms for developing, applying, and curating data. So for instance, in the IPCC, we curated snapshot of assessed scenarios for working group 1, 2, and 3, and how to improve diversity of contribution in the scenario building process. So these are the this is kind of a summary of the goals for the workshop. The workshop structure, it was over 3 days. So the first day was looking back and reviewing practices during AR6. The second day was trying to unpick specific challenge and specific topics to discuss them. And then the third day was looking ahead towards recommendations for AR7, but also future assessments. And it's important to emphasize that the day 1 and 2 findings were or discussions all fed into the discussions for day 3. So it was pretty much active and on the ground trying to organize how the discussions shape up as we progress the workshop. And the recommendations focused on 5 key groups. The scientific community is involved in the modeling, scientific community is not involved in modeling, research funders, IPCC itself, and also communication or communicating scenarios groups.
Okay, so now I pick up.
Over to Anna,
yep.
Yes.
Thanks, Alaa. So now just looking first briefly at the first 2 days of the workshop. So we were discussing the lessons learned and challenges. And this is a bird's eye view of the breakout group discussions that we held over those 2 days. I'm not going to read this out, but you can see on day 1, we looked at how the assessment of scenarios was handled in the IPCC AR6. And on day 2, we started picking out some more focused topics. Some of them were nominated from the floor. Most were pre-prepared with the scientific steering committee. And what's nice to emphasize is that all of these meetings were cross-working group in nature. So we tried not to have a siloed discussion. And and this is just really to show you the breadth of the workshop. And from there, we then moved on to a forward-looking mode and extracting those outlook views and recommendations. If we go to the next slide, at the beginning in the first plenary session, we also had plenaries with keynote talks and so on to set the stage. We also had some interactive instances with the participants in plenary. So we ran these Mentimeter sessions. We asked a question here, what climate scenarios have been successful for? And you can see some obvious and expected terms coming out, such as integration, collaboration, and exploration and policy impact. And one thing that's communication is very large. It's sort of very helpful tool to communicate integrated findings. And then we also have things like confusion popping up rather prominently. So already an indication of the challenges in navigating the scenario landscape and the results. Then we went to another question that was, what are the key challenges with using scenarios to inform policymakers? And communication is central. So it is a tool which very much helps communication, but then at the same time, there are many barriers in understanding and unpicking the scenario-based findings. And amongst all of that, you see in the words, the reasons perhaps why the complexity, the uncertainties, are there inconsistency issues? What are the plausibility aspects in using scenarios? And there are some large also question marks around inclusivity, equity, and how you actually can practically connect scenario-based assessment findings with practical applications in the policy sphere. So it really opens up a pool of challenges that we're dealing with. So if we go on to the next slide, I'm not going to go into the details of the first 2 days outcomes, but each of these bogs has in the report a summary of the key discussion outcomes, so you can read up about this. But in synthesis, there were some important emerging challenges. And first of all, looking at scenarios, not only in terms of a climate question or climate questions, but in the context of development and other challenges. So how are we linking to SDGs, progress on achieving SDGs, how the climate scenarios connect with assessment of biodiversity changes and future changes. How can scenarios be used to explore future shifts? This was an interesting discussion that was asking, what if we're following one pathway at one point, but then there is a significant shift that brings us onto perhaps another narrative? How do we take these shifts into account? And obviously this brings questions of tipping points, what overshoot and irreversible changes how they're addressed in the current scenario framework, and shocks and recovery. Also, somewhat similar, how to explore disequilibrium responses where rates of change are unexpected. And when in working group 1, for example, we've explored the low likelihood, high impact events of the physical climate system, but also in the socioeconomic domain. How are we able to unpack these more complex dynamics from the current scenario framing? And we highlighted across these discussions the need for stronger integration of vulnerability and exposure change, looking at future drivers of risk, and an increasing need to focus on adaptation, where perhaps there was a strong emphasis of the outcomes of the sixth assessment related to scenario findings for the climate system and mitigation options, but maybe on adaptation pathways and scenarios, there was a more complex view, so harder to distinguish the relationship with the scenarios. And the connection with scales, going down from the global scale, going right down to city level scales, how are we going to be handling that? And the societal distribution of risks, the kind of the scenario narratives handle this, the multiplicity of issues related to gender, ethnicities, wealth and income distribution, generational and regional differences and distributional aspects. So the next slide, we also noticed and saw that coming through quite strongly throughout the meeting, the need to strengthen linkages even further. So we did see how scenarios were an integrating factor amongst communities and very successful in many ways, but there are some weak or missing links with some communities. So we discussed how to strengthen links with, for example, economic modeling and social sciences, and discussed the wide range of social sciences that is encompassing. And not only just linking, but how these communities can actually feed into the scenario design and development. And then the link to biodiversity and the assessment of resources was flagged as another key link that needs to be strengthened going forward into the AR7. So the next slide. So now, if you could click again, thanks, Alaa. Moving into the kind of the outcomes part of the workshop. So this is a summary. We're just going to focus on the summary of conclusions that were directed, shall we say, towards the scientific communities involved in modeling. So broadly speaking, what we think was most interesting for the Iconics community. This is the outcome of day 3. And as I said, we have a very comprehensive report. So you're really encouraged to go and see the outcomes of the other discussions that were held in parallel. So there is some duplication in the messages, and this is normal and expected, I suppose. But so if we move forward, thinking about issues relevant for the Iconics community and so on. So first of all, a very large or substantive part of our discussion on the final day was related to updating and improving community scenario frameworks. And there were different views expressed on the continued use and updating and improvement of scenario frameworks, and also on the choice of what are the policy relevant scenarios, what are the possible future climate outcomes. So the range of covering high warming outcomes with more high ambition scenarios, which are Paris Agreement compatible, and how to connect the scenario framework development with these intersections that I just mentioned, such as linking the climate changes with biodiversity and SDGs and so on. So thanks, Alaa. And then the next bullet after that. Oh, you think you can just click through? It's a long list of little bullets, but there was a call from across the board. Different, as Alaa said, very many different communities were involved in this meeting, and so there were many requests to develop a more diverse set of scenario narratives and drivers. Equity considerations came out loudly, and we maybe come back to that. But also going beyond the need to go beyond 2100 and how this is important for linking to the impacts and adaptation vulnerability community, but linking more substantively to the AIV community in the development process of scenarios was highlighted. And as I mentioned previously, in the challenges that were noted, there is the policy relevance of from global going down to the higher resolution national, subnational, and city level scenarios, how to handle air pollution controls and health aspects, and also the regional role of aerosols. And the adaptation mitigation connection, which was a very strong integrative and synthetic outcome of the AR6, was discussed in how this will be handled going forwards with scenario frameworks. So how will adaptation pathways be developed? What about considering limits to adaptation and the feedbacks between different adaptation and mitigation strategies and directions and narratives? And then looking at different characteristics of scenarios that we'd want to explore, very much the issue of net zero came up, and that in the context of implementing the various options related to negative emissions. So the next slide. Key in all of this discussion, especially from, but not only from users and policymakers, was a request for transparency and inclusivity in the process of scenario design and development. So one of the key challenges in the discussion was what the process would be for designing and prioritizing the choices of scenarios that would be driving the Earth system models in the next round of the couple model into comparison project. And this came up, I think, from many quarters, that there could be mechanisms put in place to increase the participation of users and policymaker communities into highlighting what their most urgent needs and expectations might be, and identifying the scientifically as well as policy relevant choices. And so we know that the scenario protocols go through peer review, but not all the different constituents in this meeting and those that are interested in these choices necessarily work through those types of documentations. And so maybe encouraging an open review process of the scenario protocols that also takes into account different levels of technical understanding and access amongst those communities when doing this outreach. So those particularly not involved with modeling necessarily. So the next slide, please. There was a lot of the science was discussed at this meeting, and so ideas, obviously non-exhaustive ideas, came up on future research activities and model into comparison projects. So one question that was an issue that there was mainly SSP2 that was assessed in Working Group 3, and the need to assess a broader range of scenarios, and this was just perhaps a bias or missing in the available literature. So this is a consequence of the studies that had been undertaken. And with Earth system models, there was a wealth of topics that were brought up, but some of the key issues were looking at carbon cycle feedbacks, land surface, vegetation models, implementing the higher complexity and latest generation land surface and vegetation models. And from the integrated assessment modeling side, looking more into how aerosols, land use patterns, what about ecosystem services and biodiversity, and exploring more widely the energy demand issues. And then one characteristic of the AR6 was the use of emulators or simple climate models to further explore the uncertainties or parameter space of the more complex Earth system climate models. And this was a very powerful tool in Working Group 1, but also in connecting with the assessment of the mitigation pathways in working group 3. And so extending this use of emulators, we've discussed, for example, regional emulators and emulators that are able to pick up some of these processes and resolution issues that are coming up in these discussions. And so on the next slide, about enhancing resolution. So enhancing temporal and spatial resolution was a kind of constant request, I suppose. And so this was about improving regional, but also temporal resolution, for example, integrated assessment models to capture more comprehensively the near term. And then if you start clicking through, Alaa, thanks. So this has been, I've already said this a couple of times, so this business of going down from the global to a more realistic or more detailed representation of regional and sub-regional changes, and this strong call for connecting scenarios to city scale studies, particularly with the oncoming or soon to be launched cities special climate report, special reports in the AR7, so cities and climate change. This is going to be probably the first product coming along in the AR7. And with regards to resolution, the connection to those communities that are undertaking downscaling studies, stability of scenarios across CMIP cycles, for example, is an issue where there's a disconnect that emerges in the literature because of the timescales in generating global simulations. And then when the regional climate model simulations are run, we would see that very clearly in Working Group 1 and 2, it's CMIP 6 in Working Group 1, and many studies in Working Group 2 are based on CMIP 5 because of the connection to Cordex and experiments like that. And then not only just increasing resolution, but this connection across resolutions, so encouraging multi-scale studies. I see Jim Ski has raised his hand, but I'll carry on regardless. So connecting between the short and the long term and across the spatial scales. And finally, we noted one of the conclusions from this discussion, if you just click again. Alaa, thank you. The issue of baselines was another topic that came up, and open access to the data around the baseline so that different communities could use these in a more consistent approach and perhaps reducing the need for harmonization. So that's all. I'm going to hand over to Alaa, and we do already have some hands coming up. And I would suggest at this stage, if you could possibly put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll come back at the end, unless anyone else disagrees with that. Alaa, if you prefer to carry on.
Yeah, thanks very much, Anna. So just to reiterate that we are only presenting the discussion of one bog out of 23 bogs, but this was one of the most extensive. Actually, it was the most extensive bog during the workshop. We also, one of the topics that were discussed is broadening the assessment of scenarios and modeling approaches. So essentially enhancing the scenario data assessment beyond the use of statistical analysis. So while statistical analysis, of course, are important, they're not the only tool in assessing scenarios data. And there was a lot of talk during the workshop mentioned in a couple of rooms about the science of assessing scenarios data using qualitative and quantitative methods. So this is kind of there is a move in that direction. Assessing scenarios that have not passed the vetting test or the vetting criteria, or they are not suitable for full climate assessment. So while the data is for all scenarios is available publicly, those that passed the vetting and the climate assessment and those that didn't, the idea here is that we also assess and try to unpick insights and useful information from those scenarios that did not pass these checks. And then considering non-climate outcome in conditional plausibility in scenarios outcomes as well. So essentially consider the effects that are not directly related to the climate, and consider conditional likelihood of certain outcome based on specific assumptions or conditions, for instance, such as energy demand, in the context of Working Group 3, and then continuing to explore not only global least cost scenarios, but also other options, such as higher cost or different benefits that could be also examined. We also, still within the same topic, explore a range of potential options on solution spaces to Paris Agreement, and this is something we did in Working Group 3, which we call these scenarios the illustrative mitigation pathways, and also assessment of regional, national, and local scenarios, including gray literature, something that Anna touched upon. So gray literature essentially refer to reports or working paper or government documents that could take part of the assessments. Increasing interaction between global models and sectoral models. So this is something that Working Group 1 did intensively in AR6, which is a multiple lines of evidence kind of assessment. And this is something that was discussed whether Working Group 3 and AR7 could do that to ensure that there is a holistic view of potential impact and resolution. And one should recognize that this was done in Chapter 3 of, in a section of Chapter 3 of Working Group 3 report in AR6. Encourage development of national scale models to feed into NDCs and Paris Agreement contributions, and then diversifying modeling communities through well-funded capacity building activities to ensure to broaden the variety of contribution to climate modeling and make sure that we have a variety of perspective and solution covered in the assessment. Another topic that was discussed is strengthening the links to impact, adaptation, vulnerability communities. So essentially advocating a dialogue for ongoing discussion about incorporating the SSPs into Working Group 2 contribution to the next assessment cycle of the IPCC where suitable from a scientific perspective, developing impact and adaptation pathways that incorporate future scenarios of exposure and vulnerability. So essentially exploring how to adapt to and mitigate climate impact, taking into account projected exposure or vulnerability scenarios. Including irreversible impacts, ecosystem shocks, tipping points, and scenarios, and reflecting on biophysical constraints. One other kind of topic discussed here, also exploring the effects of policy actions on impacts and future risks. So that's the interaction between policy and impacts assessments, and then investigating the implication of climate impacts on different groups. So examining how climate change effects can vary among different population groups and in terms of equity and poverty alleviation. And then encouraging plurality of scenario development. So this is a theme, cross-cutting theme that emerged across different blocks. So for scenario development approaches, either for mitigation or adaptation, including modeled or non-modeled inputs such as qualitative inputs. Another topic that was discussed as well is exploring scenarios of exceedance and return. So that's overshoot of level of global warming. So a comprehensive range of scenarios or overshoot scenarios and their characteristics, including magnitude and duration, to be kind of explored in more detail in future assessments. Connecting with communities working on tipping point, threshold, and including delayed impact. So not only immediate and apparent impact, but also impact, detection of impacts beyond 2100, as Anna mentioned earlier, as well as irreversible impacts. This was also an important point raised, which is exploring the role of land-based CDR, so afforestation, reforestation, after net zero, and the degree of overshoot on effectiveness of such removal. So not only in the cases of a peak and decline scenarios, but also the impact on effectiveness in the case of how high the temperature can go. building on progress in land surface and vegetation models to inform possible outcomes of effectiveness of removal. So essentially advances in modeling how land surface and vegetation respond to changes in climate in order for us to better predict the potential impact on carbon removals. And then conducting emission-driven Earth system model runs to understand uncertainties in land use sector and climate impacts. And this is to help us improve our understanding of how these uncertainties essentially contribute to climate change and how the different parts of the climate system interact. We also discussed scenarios databases, and the discussion in this area was mostly focused on working group 3 database. Making the database live, the scenarios database live, and continuous activity with open access to all scenarios, those that passed the vetting and did not pass the vetting, which is something that is work in progress at the moment, already including wider range of scenarios, variables, including UNFCCC emission data, for instance, or national emission submissions, improving the infrastructure and flexibility of the process in order to allow wider range of scenarios beyond integrated assessment model scenarios to be to take part of the database. And again, this there has been a lot of work in AR6 on this, not only including global scenarios but also regional and national, the sectoral ones. And then continue to improve scenarios, as I said, global, sectoral, and national use, and then ensure community ownership and funding support for the database so that we have stable infrastructure, which is, again, something work in progress and ongoing, and then broadening the type of information. So one of the points that were raised that include endogenous knowledge and local knowledge into the data things. One more topic, I think, on justice and equity, which kind of cut across almost all the breakout groups that we had in this workshop. So essentially raising the point that models do not always capture many dimensions of equity and justice, and further work need to be done on that, developing justice framework that could be applied to scenarios, and building on robust literature on justice, fairness, and equity. Use indicators beyond GDP, such as multidimensional indicators of well-being, and then go beyond least cost mitigation pathways. That's something was raised in multiple plenaries during the proceeding of the workshop. And then, of course, when it's come to adaptation, include inequity consideration in scenarios such as financial inequity, vulnerability, loss and damage, and governance issues. And then here, just to kind of wrap up, there are more discussions that took place in this breakout group, but we kind of focused on the kind of the most extensive one. But there are also cross-cutting themes within this breakout group and across the entire workshop, such as plausibility and feasibility of future outcomes. Cities and urban settlement focus on that level, granular level, as Anna mentioned earlier. Focus on near-term action, risk adaptation and limits, which is something I mentioned earlier in the impact adaptation and vulnerability slides. Participation and inclusivity, so not only IMs, but also other modeling approaches, capacity building, and through workshops and webinars, regional modeling communities, supporting regional model communities, and the inclusion of social sciences, as Anna mentioned earlier. And then in terms of communication, so this one, we kind of somewhat stole from the communication book, but it's also was discussed in this breakout group, which is customized communication focused on the end user or the recipient of this information, aligning user expectation and scenarios constraint. There is always some level of misalignment there. So what scenarios can do, transparency in terms of underlying assumptions, in terms of the underlying question for the specific scenario runs, and any potential biases in the estimates. Labeling, clear labeling, consistent across different cycles, as Anna mentioned earlier, to allow for consistent interpretation across cycles, documentation, and then continuous or continued capacity building efforts. So this is the kind of summary, if you will, of one breakout group. We tried to bring elements of other breakout groups as well into the summary. So thank you very much for your attention. And then we have also here the link for the report. The report is available on IPCC website, but also the link is here provided, and these slides will be shared after the webinar. So over to you, Chris. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna and Alaa. That was really an amazing summary of a very detailed meeting. As you can see, there was a breadth and depth of topics that were covered. And looking forward to the AR7 of a broad range of activities needed in the scenarios community. I invite the members of the Science Steering Committee who are on this call to turn on your cameras. And we look forward to people putting their questions into the Q&A. But first, I was going to call on Jim Ski, because you put your hand up for a moment, Jim.
Yeah, I had multiple windows open and clicked on the wrong window. There was no intention of intervening in the meeting. So I will forego this possibility, Chris.
There's nothing you wanted to add at this moment? I will turn to the other members of the SSC, but I wanted to start with one comment implicit to the presentation, is that the meeting underscored the usefulness right now of the RCP SSP framework, and that you heard there's extensive work to extend, to elaborate on the scenarios for use in the AR7 as the complexity of the issues covered in the AR7 continues to increase. So I thought from the perspective of Iconics, it was an endorsement of the work that's been done and lays out a pretty comprehensive roadmap of what we need over the next few years. We also have online Claudia Tibaldi, who just turned off her camera, Brian O'Neill, and Jan, whose last name I never quite get right. And so I'll just leave that you can say your last name, because I'm just not going to butcher another person's last name this morning. It's too early. Is there anything that any of you would like to add as the questions are coming into the chat? Jan, you look like you're ready to say something. Oh, Brian's got his hand up. Brian.
Well, I just wanted to, I see we have a couple of questions in the Q&A on transparency of integrated assessment models, and that is a well-identified topic that's been on the table for a long time. A lot of progress is being made there. I think it was not a key topic at the meeting, and so I don't think this is a great place to take up that rather specialized conversation, but one that is better for another venue. But we for sure all are in favor of making IAMs and their assumptions as transparent as possible. And this is a feeling that is shared by the IAM groups themselves. And a lot of strides have been made in that direction. But I think, as Chris said, we have a plethora of topics that were raised at the meeting that we might want to spend more of our time on.
Jan or Claudia, is there anything you'd like to add?
Well, I can just add that during the AR6, it was very clear that scenarios played a key role in all three working groups. And quite early in the process, we started building a bridge between working group 1 and 3. We developed these emulators that were calibrated and captured the updated knowledge from working group 1, so the scenarios and the grouping of scenarios in working group 3 were consistent with working group 1. But we also realized that there's a great potential for increasing the link between 1 and 2 and 2 and 3. And that scenarios can be a key building bridge there. So that's something we can bring with us to AR7, and also hope that the communities will provide the literature and studies needed for that. Thanks.
And that is a key point, is how to get this information to funders. And as there's funding calls over the next couple of years, that those funding calls will address some of the key issues of interest to negotiators to inform what we're going to be doing next in terms of the science and in terms of the commitments. There's a question in the Q&A, Jim, that I think it's for you. Do you think there might be scope in your crystal ball for the AR7 to have a cross working group scenarios author meeting?
Yeah, I mean, just to say on that, I think one of the recommendations that actually came out right at the start of the 6th cycle was to actually have a group of authors across the different working groups that sort of in an active working sleeves rolled up kind of way continued to address the question of scenarios as an integrating mechanism, across the 3 working groups. And I would head out there. I frankly, given the comprehensiveness of the meeting that we've just had, I don't think there's necessarily a scope for another IPCC meeting right at the start of the 7th cycle. But well, since frankly we've had a scenarios meeting every cycle forever, I can't imagine that we will not have another scenarios meeting further down the line. But I don't think there's a call for one in the next year or two, although I understand, and I'd look at Anna on this, I think the Korean government has actually suggested having a scenarios meeting, which it will convene itself, and we need to think about how we could make best use of that meeting for IPCC. But maybe Anna knows more about that one than I do, and where we are on it.
Yeah, I can come in here. It's just to note that this isn't an IPCC meeting that's been planned. So the government of the Republic of Korea approached Jan and myself actually at the end of a special event we organized at the last COP on hearing the experiences and needs of government representatives in using scenarios. And they were enthusiastic about fostering more of this conversation. In terms of the timeline, it's very nice to see, since the AR6 wrapped up, we've had a succession of activities happening, including the workshop. There are meetings going on in the community. There is the scenarios forum context that's happened as well. So a whole process of debriefing has happened. The Korean meeting would be scheduled perhaps for November this year, but there are challenges in that timing for various reasons. So it could be an opportunity to help promote coordination, or it could also be an opportunity to promote a consultative process. It's sort of out there as an option. But just to say that there is a section on recommendations for the IPCC itself, and an expert meeting was expert meeting or a special report on scenarios were also discussed by participants. The experience of the 1.5 special report was really critical in facilitating integration across the working groups, and it was flagged as a very good lesson learned and how that might go forward in the AR7. And also the institutionalization of coordination of scenarios was emphasized. In this cycle, we had an ad hoc group of representatives of the Bureau and TSU and authors across the working groups, checking in at each stage where key decisions were being made on the presentation of scenario findings, for example, in the working groups for consistency. But this was an ad hoc process. And so there are suggestions to make this much more integrated and institutionalized in the working groups from the beginning.
And if I could add that, we had experience in previous rounds of having at least a dedicated meeting where you look across an issue that's so critical for integration across the 3 working groups. We have some other questions in the chat. We've got justice and equity, which were, as Shonali noted, of high concern across the meeting. There was lots of discussion. about the importance of having elaborations around justice, equity, and on governance. Concrete suggestions, the meeting was raising essentially a research agenda. The question is the extent to which that's going to be picked up. And this meeting highlighted how important those issues are for the AR7. Jim?
Yeah. I mean, just to say, this was something, you know, as you say, it was a really important point. And one of the points of regret that I think the meeting expressed was the very exclusive focus on SSP2 by the community over the last few years. And frankly, we'd have been in a much better position, specifically if there had been more attention to SSP1 as well in the mitigation community. So I think the messaging was, you know, actually it needs to be, we need to step outside and beyond, I think, the current SSP framework, just a little bit to think about that. Now, just to say, I mean, that's already progressed a little. For example, the EU under the Horizon Europe programme prospectively is thinking about what kind of calls for scenarios work might be made. And I think a strong message that came out of the meeting and has actually been heard at the EU level is the need to involve people from developing countries in a wider range of perspectives much earlier in the scenario development process. So they don't get involved just when you execute the research, but to get involved much earlier in the framing kind of activities. So I think the question of what constitutes equity and what are the appropriate metrics for equity are something that, you know, will need to be debated more in the scientific community, because there isn't entirely an agreement at the moment.
And if I could add to that, it's really important that funders outside the EU pick up these topics as well. Jim, from your slides, we know that much of the scenario work, the research has been funded by the EU, and a diversity of funders would be helpful in this space. Anna?
Yeah, just to highlight especially the discussion that developed recommendation for funders. That is one of the central parts of the outcomes of the workshop. There's a lot of call for extensions, for diversifying the community, doing capacity building, enhancing the participation on activities, for example, of the scenario database. And all of this requires robust and long-term funding arrangements. So I'm quite happy to say that there are some conclusions in the report that are focusing on participation, representation, capacity, infrastructure, and then the science of scenarios and their assessment.
And that's something that this community can take forward in thinking about the whole communication aspect and the different communities to whom capacity has to be built, and thinking about opportunities within scientific meetings of building more capacity to understand what's been done, what data, methods, and tools are available, and helping get more researchers up to speed on using the scenarios, specifically in Working Group 2, some aspects of Working Group 2. Alaa, you're going to answer the next question from Georgios.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, on the ecosystem or disparate ecosystem of climate data, indeed, and as you highlight in the WRI link, there is a wide range of climate data platforms. Whether it makes sense for the IPCC to kind of integrate these, this would be kind of initiative has to be done by the communities themselves rather than led by the IPCC. What we did in AR6 in the IPCC is we had a curation working group called TG Data, which is task group on data curation for climate assessment. And what we did is we curated the used data in the assessment, or a snapshot of the used data in the assessment, and we made it publicly available. But for curating data or ongoing development of data, this would have to be led by the scientific community. I'm not sure if others from the SSC or Anna would like to come in as well.
I maybe just emphasize that there's a go-to place for data that's assessed in the IPCC report. So if you go on the website of the IPCC, there's a subheading called data, and you access the portal of the Data Distribution Center. It's really quite an impressive tool. We've been implementing FAIR data principles as a pilot in this AR6 cycle, and the recommendation there is to fully implement FAIR in the AR7. So, for example, for Working Group 1, you can find a catalogue of all the figures that have the data available, where there is the code available, CC BY licenses are encouraged, and yeah. So, I mean, that's a bit more information, but just to emphasize that the IPCC recognizes this challenge and tries to provide an entry point to the data that's assessed in the report.
The next question we have is from Heather, and it's engagement in scenario development, which is not really the topic of this meeting. It is something that Iconics, the IMC consortium, and others are working on, and certainly there's more that can be done in those spaces. Would someone like to add more to that? Unfortunately, much of that work is unfunded, and so it is a commitment from scientists to try and build that capacity to do that engagement, but without the funding, it does become a bit of a challenge. It's good to hear from Jim that the EU is interested in providing some support for that engagement going forward. Jim and then Brian.
Yeah, I mean, maybe, Chris, just to make one very obvious point that we raised right at the start and really emphasized at the workshop and in the report that's online, is that IPCC doesn't have any scenarios. There are only scenarios assessed by IPCC. So the point about what is the job of the community and what is the job of IPCC was something that was very specifically addressed at the workshop. The panel took a decision quite some time ago that IPCC did not produce scenarios. So things like the scenarios database that IASA hosts belongs to the community. It does not belong to IPCC. It's assessed by IPCC, but it doesn't belong to it.
Thank you for making that point. We should have made that before more clearly. Brian?
Yeah, I would just say that maybe 2 points. That said, IPCC has played an important role in bringing in different types of voices to the scenario process in meetings like this one. So, to the extent that IPCC can continue to play that role, it has a unique capability to bring people from many different perspectives together. Meetings like this one that was just held are a really important way for engaging different communities in the process. The other thing is that this particular topic, in bringing in different perspectives, as well as the many others that were raised, are really calls to the whole community, as opposed to some central organization that watches out for the scenario enterprise in general. There really isn't quite such a thing, and so for engaging different communities, that's a task for all of us in any particular project that might be being undertaken. One example I would say here is the NGFS, or the Network for Greening of the Financial System, which is a effort taken up in the community to develop scenarios with a particular perspective from the financial community. And so to the degree that more of those kinds of efforts can be undertaken to facilitate additional perspectives, then the better off we'll be.
Thank you. That's great. And I see we're just 5 minutes from the end. I invite all of you to provide some closing comments if you'd like to make some closing comments. And we've got just a couple of open questions in the chat that I think could be easily addressed by an answer. Would anyone like to say any closing comments? It was obviously quite a in-depth overview of a very complex meeting that's going to be incredibly important for the foundation of the AR7. Jim and then Jan.
Yeah, I mean, just quickly on the two questions. I mean, I do think I could find out what the assumptions are in SSP2 and SSP1, you know, for each of the models by looking the database. In fact, the fact that these assumptions have been transparent has provided the capacity for some people to actually criticize the scenarios themselves. So there's enough transparency out there for that. So I think I rather disagree with the premise on that question. And just on Omar's question about antitrust efforts, I mean, honestly, IPCC doesn't have a position on anything. We're supposed to be a scientific body. And frankly, if there is literature on that topic that would refer to IPCC activity, relate to IPCC activities, it would be assessed in the next cycle, I presume. But we don't write the literature, and that is a little bit out of the scope of this topic. I mean, I guess the final point I would just make is this job didn't solve all the problems of scenarios either in IPCC or in the communities. You can regard it, I think, as one step on a longer journey, which will go on for a very long time. And there will be other meetings within the context of IPCC. There will be other meetings by the community that IPCC is not in charge of. And these meetings will interact with each other and move on.
Thank you, Jim. That's great. Jan?
Yes, thank you. One experience from the AR6 process was that we, during the work, learned that we didn't have much material on overshoot. And working group 1 had one low overshoot scenario, just crossing 1.5 and then returning to 1.4. And then we had one quite high overshoot scenario, which was used more for sensitivity studies and understanding what's reversible and what's irreversible. And then working group 3 had low overshoot and high overshoot categories. But when it came to working group 2, we didn't have much material. So when it came to the synthesis report, we really had to put these things together in different ways based on quite heterogeneous literature basis and assessment basis in the working group reports. So that is clearly a signal and something we learned in this process, that more overshoot scenarios are needed. Thanks.
Well, thank you, everyone. We're just about at time. Really want to thank Alaa and Anna for an excellent presentation. We will share the slides afterwards so people can have access to those. Want to thank the members of the SSC who joined the call and answered some questions, and look forward to further discussions around scenario development as we start rolling towards the AR7. And invite all of you to follow the kinds of webinars we have on Iconics. We'll have more coming up, schedule some more in the fall. So thank you very much, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.